So if they don't get another clicker, people are just going to have to use the arrow keys. So I apologize. It's unfortunate that the gear broke right at this moment, but we're trying to rectify it. All right, Wynn, good luck.
So I'm going to ask everybody to come up here.
Sure.
And we're ready to get
And we'll just sit in these chairs right here.
Yeah, I think I'm going to start out up there.
So I've recreated a little bit of an outline. This is a surprise, not to have any of the things that I prepared, but I had just a few kind of core questions in my head. One for Pam, which is sort of what can sustainability science actually teach us? It's something that's like 15 years ahead of us and thinking about interdisciplinary efforts. John, sort of what are some of the hopeful stories from either technological developments or governance or behavior change that should give us some hope that these kinds of challenges can be met, and then sort of exploring this issue of how you address population in a way that is a better relationship between the kind of environmental community and the public health community in the first attempt, which was really just about that.
So why don't we can start with, why don't you lead off with questions? This was Indola's question, so.
Well, it's the same question. Well, it's almost the same. She can answer that question if I ask her this question.
So, okay, I think we should probably get going. I'm going to ask these guys to come on up, and then after,
So after my remarks, I guess the question is how do we get into questions?
well, after your, first, you're going to do your remarks, then just turn it to Pam.
Yeah.
And then we'll just go through that, and then at the end of that, I think that Sam should be here, and then why don't Pam, you go next, and John, and then Lola. So that would be lovely.
And we can obviously come up to the podium for our 10 minutes.
Yep. Well, good morning. We're going to get started. I'm Judy Wasserheit from the University of Washington. And together with my co-moderator, Sam Myers, I want to welcome all of you to this session on ensuring planetary or One Health through sustainable consumption and production, looking to a sustainable future in global health. This is intentionally, quite intentionally, a follow-on to the truly inspiring keynote that Richard Horton just gave us this morning, and the terrific plenary panel that we all just heard. And it echoes again the conference theme of bridging to a sustainable future in global health. Before we get started, I want to thank Marguerite Papianu, who's sitting right here, who was really the force behind getting all of us together. So thank you, Marguerite. In fact, this session, the focus of this session, can be stated a lot more simply than that title. And indeed, as we were preparing for this session, we decided to be a little rebellious, sort of renegades, and reframe the title, that long title that I just gave you, and just say that this session is about asking the question, how does a planetary health lens actually change what we do and how we do it in global health? It's what we'd like you to have in the back of your heads. And then, in your questions and in our discussion. So, in other words, what would we do differently as global health researchers, educators, and/or practitioners if we really took an integrated systems perspective across the geosphere, the biosphere, and the humanosphere, right? If we took a planetary health paradigm to heart and really recognized the connections between natural systems and health. So our format for this session is that we're going to start off by having Sam Myers, those of you who were in the plenary just met previously, but I'm going to reintroduce him. He is the director of the Planetary Health Alliance and senior research scientist in the Department of Environmental Health at the Harvard School of Public Health. And Sam is going to set the stage for us by giving you a very brief summary of the planetary health concept, particularly in terms of thinking about the health impacts. Then Pam Matson will speak next. She is the Chester Naramore Dean at Stanford's School of Earth, Energy, and Environmental Sciences. And she's going to discuss the sustainability challenges, talk a little bit about sustainability science, and again, connect that to the impacts on health, emphasizing, I think, maybe, we'll see, this concept of intergenerational equity. Oh, good, she's not nodding. I got that one right. That's good. And then next, John Foley will speak. He is the executive director and the Kimball Chair of the California Academy of Sciences. I actually knew John in some of his previous incarnations, including as director of the University of Minnesota's Institute on the Environment, where he was also chair of global environment and sustainability. And he's going to focus on planetary boundaries and give sort of a report card on how our planet is doing with respect to those boundaries. And then finally, we're going to get to hear from Ndola Prata, who is the Bixby Chair in Population Family Planning and Director of the Bixby Center for Population Health and Sustainability at the Berkeley School of Public Health. And she's going to actually come back to Jim Shelton's question about where family planning fits in to all of this, highlighting the links between population growth, family planning on the one hand, and planetary, animal, and human health on the other. And then we'll go into what I think will be a really robust discussion. So I'm really looking forward to this session, and with that, I'm going to turn this over to Sam. Please.
All right, hi everybody again. Great to be here. So I'm going to try to keep this brief because I think a lot of you were already in the plenary, but I was asked to speak briefly about what are the kinds of health effects that we worry about in planetary health, and how does that lens provide any sort of value added, essentially. And so as I said this morning, the core proposition is essentially that we are already receiving really extraordinary public health benefits from a stable set of biophysical conditions around the planet. And those systems include a whole lot of things, including the climate system, but not limited to them. So, biogeochemical cycles, fisheries, land cover, everything that you can think about, aquatic systems, coastal barrier systems, so around the planet that actually sustain us, and that we have, sort of unbeknownst to many of us, started to slip into what's been a sort of quiet public health crisis with the erosion of so many of those systems. When we think about what the health impacts of those changes are, by and large, we're not talking about brand new health impacts, although certainly there are the emergences of new infectious diseases which get a lot of press. But by and large, we're talking about magnification or exacerbation of existing health threats. We think about, direct impacts from climate change, of heat stress and changes in air quality, changes in the distribution of infectious diseases. We think about indirect impacts from not just climate change, but from a whole host of these sort of intermingled environmental drivers which impact food security, access to water, population displacement, and surprises. And I guess I want to emphasize surprises because this is a very new field. So as much of the things that we're starting to quantify and understand are worrisome, the surprises are worrisome too. So one quick example is recent research that came out this year in Bangladesh. And people were noticing that there was an increased incidence of preeclampsia among pregnant women in Bangladesh, and started to try to understand what was going on there, and quickly discovered that there was a tight correlation between the incidence of preeclampsia and the salinity of both ground and surface water that these women were being exposed to. And it's actually subsequently been shown that not only is it preeclampsia, it's hypertension across much of that population. And it's sort of surprising because now the story's been unfolding that actually appears to be related in some ways to sea level rise and more extreme coastal storms, which are allowing intrusion of salt water into freshwater aquifers. The total contribution of those factors has still not been completely teased out, but it looks like one of these stories where a set of environmental drivers has resulted in what was really sort of a hard to predict unintended consequence. And I think we're going to see lots of those. So how does a planetary health lens help us do what we do better? And to me, this is the whole reason for this discipline, is that every bit of research that gets done in this field should be done with policy and practice implications in mind. They should be built into the research. They should be coming from the policy and management communities in the first place, and that should be an integral part of what they do. So one very quick example of that is work that we've been doing on the biomass burning in Southeast Asia. So as you know, there have been enormous fires throughout Sumatra and Kalimantan. Those fires are primarily being driven by agriculture, particularly palm oil plantations, as well as logging and timber concessions. The fires are creating these enormous haze episodes, which are also associated with dominant weather patterns, and the haze is causing a lot of morbidity and mortality. And we actually put together a team of atmospheric transport chemists and land use modelers and air pollution epidemiologists to model that entire system, from the land use decisions to the fires associated with different land use types, to the emissions from those fires and their atmospheric transport through space and time, to the downwind population exposures to PM 2.5 and the ultimate health effects. And by building that integrated model across multiple disciplines, we are able to characterize a system so that now we're actually in the middle of a set of discussions with the Indonesian government, which has created this new peatlands conservation office, to use that model to try to calculate the public health dividends that would be associated with different policy decisions that are on the table about which peatlands to protect and how to manage land in certain parts of Sumatra and Kalimantan. And so that's just an example, I think, throughout this session. If we can characterize and understand these relationships that are often complex between how we manage natural systems and ultimately the health implications, then we can manage those systems in ways that optimize not only conservation outcomes, but also public health outcomes. So to me, that's the core of why this is a useful lens. But I think now we're going to turn it to our speakers and then to some questions.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Could I have the slides, please? Or maybe I just pressed the button. There we go. Oops, back. Okay. All right, well, thank you very much. First of all, thank you to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this session, and I've already learned a lot in the morning, and look forward to more. I am a biogeochemist. I've spent most of my career working on global environmental change issues, climate change and other kinds of changes. And I've spent the second half of this career focused on trying to work in interdisciplinary ways, focused on social and environmental systems, to look for solutions that make sense for people and the planet over the long run. I have not been a part of the discussion about planetary health. So it's very fun for me to come here and learn about your conversations, your directions, and to realize there's a great deal in common between this and another emerging field, which is sustainability science. So I want to tell you a little bit about that very quickly and some examples, and then we'll move on to discussion. So I'm using the word sustainability, and a lot of people kind of say, well, let's not go there. It's a word that doesn't have any real meaning. It's used in so many different ways. So let me just start with that question. What does sustainability mean? I'm sure many of you have participated in the sustainable development community in one way or the other, and there, of course, we're talking about working hard to help some of the poorest places on the planet grow and develop economically and maybe socially, but do it in a way that doesn't get in the way of next generation's ability to do so. So focusing, at least in part, on environment and resource issues. And that goes way back to the Brundtland Report and even before that. And we've had the Millennium Development Goals, and we have now the 2015 Sustainable Development Goals. And you can see they're about human health and well-being, but they're also about the environment. Now, if you go to the corporate world, you have a completely different picture, not completely different, but a slightly different picture about sustainability. For them, they're asking the question, how can we be successful corporations economically, but also pay attention to environment and pay attention to equity and social issues, because that's going to mean our long-term success. So they talk about the triple bottom line, or the 3 Ds, or the three-legged stool. We in universities, many of us, have sustainability programs. We win awards for using our energy and water and food resources efficiently and effectively, and so on. So, the term is used a lot by a lot of different people. I would argue, though, that it's not a corrupt term. There's some really strong links that tie our use of the term. First of all, I think all of these approaches pay attention not just to people here today, but have an interest in long term, in future generations as well. And they all recognize that if we're going to do that, we have to figure out how to use our resources more effectively and efficiently, but also protect the environment, the life support system that we're living in here, or some people would call this natural capital, so that future generations can have their needs met as well as we do. Now, that idea, that framing of it is what was used by the U.S. National Academy's Board on Sustainable Development back in the 1990s. Meet the needs of people, sustain the life support systems of the planet, reduce hunger and poverty, and as we go. And it strikes me that these themes are very much the themes of planetary health, as I've seen it defined in the readings I've done leading up to this meeting. Health and well-being and equity. It's the well-being of people. And I think when I read that last phrase, so humanity can flourish, I think I read in there a very strong commitment to not just us today around the world, but our future generations. So I'm arguing, I guess, that the goal of both the sustainability effort in which I've been engaged for so long and the planetary health issue that you're raising here is that we have to find a way to support intergenerational well-being, not just of people here, but all around the world, not just people today, but in future generations. So well-being, what does that mean? Obviously, health is a huge part of that group of characteristics of well-being. Meeting people's needs for food and energy and water and other things is in there. Education, opportunity, including to be employed, for example, security. All of those things are typically in the literature and in conversations encompassed as characteristics of well-being. And obviously they're all very tightly interacting. So we can ask the question, how are we doing in terms of human well-being? And if we go through this list, things are getting better around the planet. Kilocalorie daily consumption and annual consumption for most people has increased, and the health issues are getting better in many places. Infant mortality rates are in decline. Lifespans have increased, and if you use that as an indicator of overall health, it looks pretty good. Prior to the 1800s, and for most of human history, most people only lived to 30. And we've tripled that in many parts of the world now. But you can also see that there's still a lot of variability, and there's a lot of people whose well-being is not being, that goal of well-being is not being met. So there's a tremendous amount of work to do there. And actually, there's a tremendous amount of work to do in a number of areas. Today, there are 1 billion people, mostly adult women, 1 billion adults, mostly women, who can't read. 1 billion people without adequate shelter, more than 1 billion without access to sanitation. Close to 1 billion people go to bed hungry a lot of the time, and that's today. Our population is still growing, as you all know, maybe leveling off towards the end of this century at, 9 to 12 billion people. And so there's going to be a lot more needs to be met, a lot more people whose well-being is to be a concern. So then, if we're working towards this goal of intergenerational well-being, what do we do? What determines well-being? And there's a lot of different ways to frame this. Some are complicated, some are simple. I'm going to share with you a framing that Bill Clark at Harvard and Krista Anderson at Colorado and I just put together and published in this book. And it's a framing that links human well-being ultimately through our production and consumption processes to a set of capital assets that can't decline. If they decline, we're in trouble intergenerationally. So human well-being at the top, we are the actors, the agents that carry out a whole set of consumption and production processes. How we do that really matters. But these things are interconnected, and we tend to not want to separate them out as let's just worry about consumption, because consumption and production are very much connected. And how we do both of those matters, clearly. But ultimately, intergenerational well-being, that goal is going to be determined by a set of capital assets that we have to have, and that if they decline, future generations are going to be in trouble. And the list is there at the bottom. Here's another way of looking at them, as they're part of our complex, coupled social and environmental systems in which everything on this planet plays out. And they include human capital, of course, the numbers, the demographics, the capabilities, the health of the people in a place making these decisions. Social capital, all of the laws and norms and institutional structures, the governance, the financial workings that affect how we interact and use resources and try to meet well-being. Manufactured capital, that's all the infrastructure, the buildings, the roads, the technologies, the gadgets that we use every day, some of which could be useful for, and some of which are useful for intergenerational well-being. Natural capital is really in many ways at the base. This is our climate, our atmosphere, our ecosystems on land and in the oceans that provide so much of what we need and that future generations will need. And then knowledge capital. So what we want is this asset base to work together in quite complicated ways to raise up people, to support our well-being and over generations. And to do so, they can't be going down. But unfortunately, natural capital especially is going down, it's in decline. And there's just a few examples. I know John Foley will talk about some more. Sam already mentioned some of these. Region-wide tides of air pollution with immediate human health consequences as well as long-term impacts on the global system. Climate change, acidification of the oceans, the loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services, and on and on. And part of the problem is that in the past, what we've done is work very hard to meet the needs of people for our health benefits and for all of those other important aspects of well-being, but inadvertently have driven down the life support systems, the natural capital. That's an inadvertent consequence. And let me give you a quick example. I always pick on food, but I could pick on energy just as well, and others. We've been incredibly successful in last century in increasing food production at a rate that would meet the needs of a growing human population. Otherwise, we would have had a lot of people starving to death. But we did that through new genetic material, green revolution technologies, higher yielding crop plants, use of fertilizer, use of pesticide, use of irrigation, and so on. And those things have some immediate benefits, but also some immediate negatives for human health. But they also ultimately lead to a decline in our life support system. We've lost huge areas of land biodiversity to land use change for agriculture. And I won't go through all of these. In effect, agriculture and our effort to meet the needs of people for food have had inadvertent consequences in all of these. And so, what we've been doing is this, and unfortunately, over time, that will cause this. We'll basically, for future generations, not be able to meet the needs. Now, there's a lot of directions we could take this conversation. I'm just going to pick one, and I'm going to say, so one of the outcomes of this is climate change from energy consumption and from food production and a few other things. And climate change has a bunch of immediate consequences that we are already feeling around the world. We're in experiencing climate change, and they're directly affecting human health. And these things are only going to get worse for human health. But climate change also has consequences for other things that we and future generations are going to need, like food production. A decline in productivity and yields of many of the more significant cereal crops is projected and is already beginning to happen. And likewise, tremendous effects and damages on ecosystems and the species that live in them that also eventually come back to affect our own well-being. So we can think about ways to adapt to some of these climate-related problems, but ultimately we can't adapt our way out of this, not if we're thinking about intergenerational well-being. We've got to mitigate, we've got to stop producing the greenhouse gases and other things that drive climate change. And we've got to do it now. Otherwise, we end up 50 years from now stuck with a climate system that's already changed in serious and negative ways. So we've got 30 years to act, to shift this relationship. All right, so what do we do about it? This is the positive part. It's going to be very short because I assume most of the conversation later will be on what do we do. If we ask the question about meeting the food needs of people, there's a bunch of things we can do. It's really fun. I teach whole classes on this. Lots of us work in this in our research lives. We can increase food production in a number of really smart ways that don't have negative unintended consequences on our life support system. But we can shift diets. That has great health consequences, right? If we stopped eating red meat or reduced the amount of red meat, good health consequences in the near term, tremendous consequences, good consequences in terms of reducing greenhouse gas footprints, water footprints. Reduced waste. Right now, we lose 30 to 40% of our food production, either globally, either in the fields in the poorest countries of the world, or in people's in people's houses, kitchens in the more developed areas of the world. We could go on and on. I know you can do this in health issues as well. You can make the lists of things we can do, and that's great. But my last slide basically argues that in order to do this effectively, we can't do it in isolation. We can't live in a world of cause and effect, of action and one response, because everything we do causes interactions in this complex social environmental system. And that argues for a very different way of working on these issues and a very different team effort in order to make sure that the decisions we make for a transition to sustainability actually don't end up with more unintended negative consequences and instead move us all forward. So thank you very much.
I'm a Mac guy. This isn't working for me.
Let's see if I can help.
I think I got it. It's hey,
Got it.
hey, that works. All right, cool. Okay.
Wait a second.
Well, they'll convert to the slide thing in a minute.
Okay, good.
Okay, so we move over to the slides. Or not? Okay.
It's always good to see someone trotting up here to help.
It's there, it's just you have to turn it on the back, right?
Oh, this is a PDF, huh?
Yeah. Oh, you had a two-headed display thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm from San Francisco, so we're not allowed to use PCs. It has to be a Mac, so.
You should come to Seattle.
Yeah, no, thanks. Okay, cool. Thank you very much. Sorry for creating a little extra work there. Yeah, hi, so I'm John Foley. I'm just moved to the Bay Area, and I'm running something called the California Academy of Sciences. It's the third largest science museum in the United States, and it's the greenest museum in the world. And we're the first museum on Earth to focus our mission on sustainability. Our new mission statement is, in fact, to explore, explain, and sustain life on Earth. So I hope you get to visit us while you're here this weekend. Anyway, I couldn't be happier to follow Pam Matson, who's really one of my science heroes and somebody who's thought deeper and harder about sustainability than about anybody. So I'm really just going to be echoing, I think, a lot of the same things she was saying, but maybe from a slightly different perspective. Pam was talking a lot about intergenerational kind of equity and intergenerational, thinking of future generations and how we need to support them. I would like us to, for a moment anyway, look back at the generations that ultimately supported us. If you think about it, we've been on this planet in one form or another for about 3 to 5 million years, rough, ballpark estimate. That's about 200,000 generations of hominids have walked this planet. We're just the last of those at the moment, and there'll be some more, we hope, after us. And all of those generations have given us something. One of those generations invented fire. Another one invented the iPhone, or whatever. We didn't have to do that. We inherited all of that. So that's pretty interesting. We're standing on the shoulders of 200,000 generations that worked before us to get us where we are today. But one of those things that's quite interesting is throughout all of that history, for almost all of those 200,000 generations of hominids, one thing was undeniably true. The Earth was infinite, and we were small. So for all of that time, for 998 of those generations, that was true. Earth was infinite. We could get bigger, we could have more babies, we could spread out, we could plow up more land, we could cut down more trees, we could use more water, and it didn't matter. There was always places to expand, to go bigger, to use more, to throw our waste away, and it really didn't concern us at all for almost all of our existence. But in the last 2 generations, suddenly that entirely flipped around, and now the Earth is very, very small, and we, as a species, suddenly got very big. And it's a fundamental rewrite of our relationship to the planet. And this happened very, very suddenly if we think about this trace of human history. And it happened for 2 reasons, of course. One is there are a hell of a lot more of us. For almost all of that time, we were under 1 billion people, actually just a couple 100 million, for all of those thousands and thousands of generations. But suddenly, after the late 18th century, we rose to about 1 billion people. After World War II, we were about a little over 2 billion. And now suddenly, we're at about 7.4 billion people on the planet today. So those of us in this room have basically lived through the largest explosion in human numbers ever seen in all of history. Happened on our watch. That's pretty interesting, and we're not done yet. So that's happened, but even more importantly than that, our population is important and it gets a lot of attention, as it should, but we even changed much more as a species when it comes to our use of energy, resources, our technology, and our impact per capita, how much each of us changes the world around us, multiplied, of course, by the number of us. But even we can see here from outer space, we can see the impact of humanity on the planet. This is a picture with no names on it, no boundaries, but you can clearly see the outlines of our cities and our commerce and our activity as a species. And this is an extraordinary kind of achievement, but it's also quite worrying that we're changing the planet so very much and often unintentionally. So there are many more of us using far more technology, far more resources than any other generation in history. And we've seen this massive acceleration of history itself. If we only look back 50 years or so, we've seen about a doubling of human population, a 7-fold increase in economic activity, if you adjust for inflation and purchasing power and all that, about a 3-fold increase in food consumption, a 3-fold increase in water consumption, and a 4-fold increase in fossil fuel combustion. So, whether you like it or not, this is a really interesting period of history we're living through. In fact, in the last 50 years, we've done more not only than any other time in history, we've done more than the entire sum of human evolution on this planet combined happened on our time, right now. So whether we like it or not, this is an inflection point in human civilization. Everything just changed. Even the way we change is changing right now. And again, we're not done yet. How do we thread the needle through this inflection point in human civilization to see how we come out the other end is the ultimate defining question for us in the coming decades. So as Pam mentioned, a lot of things are getting better. Pam and I won't speak for her, but I've learned over the years, as somebody who works on global environmental issues, that if you ever want to get invited to parties, you have to stop being so damn depressing. Nobody wants you back after a while. So I always start off with, hey, guess what? Some things are getting better. There's, people alive today are living longer, better lives. As Pam pointed out, we're doubled our life expectancy. More people live in a democracy. Steven Pinker points out there's far less warfare and violence in the world today than any other time. So a lot of things are pretty good. But how long is that going to last? And that's the part where we don't get invited to parties very much anymore. We've been doing this largely at the expense of the planet's kind of natural capital, the stocks of fish, the stocks of water, the stocks of good land, the atmosphere itself. These fundamental biophysical systems in which we all depend are being degraded. And that also leaves this huge mess for future generations. We're basically ripping off the future to have a big party today. And that's not something we should be doing. All the other generations before us did not do that. Now we are. So we have to really fundamentally change these ways. One of the things we have to worry about, of course, I'm giving a little bit of a report card of all these kinds of issues we have to think about. One of the most fundamental issues we have to think about is the land resource base of our planet. This is a picture of a region deforested, of a beautiful area of forest and biodiversity, some of the most rich forest in the world, burned down to graze cattle, which is kind of a crazy. We're trading red meat for the lungs of the earth in this picture. We can step back and look at other places. This is a picture of the south central part of the Brazilian Amazon, showing over on your left in 1975, a picture of the same place here in the 70s. And if you look carefully, there's a very small road cutting through the forest and one rancher out there in the 70s. I like to think of him as some guy wearing bell bottoms and listening to Bee Gees out there. But if you go back to the same place in 2003, it's exactly the same place with the same kind of camera. You look down and it looks like Iowa. These are all huge soybean fields, which are delivering soybeans to China, to being fed to pigs, to feed pork to people who are getting wealthy living in the cities of China today. So globalization is reaching all the way across from China to the jungles of the Amazon for increasing demands of food and economic development. Incredible. If we step back even larger, and look at the whole planet, this is something I've thought a lot about over the last few years. The footprint of agriculture and food is extraordinary. 35 to 40% of all the land on Earth is used to do one thing: grow food. The green areas on this map are where our crops are being grown. The brown areas on this map are where our cows are being grown, essentially. And a lot of that green stuff, by the way, is also fed to animals. It turns out if we add together the world's pastures and the crops that we use to feed animals, especially corn and soybeans, 75% of all the acres of land in the world growing food are feeding animals. And then we turn around and eat the animals. That's one, just absurdly inefficient. But those of you, a lot of you here obviously work on health. Is that always good for us too? So the question about meat diets not only is affecting human health, it's probably the single largest thing we're doing to assault the planet, period, of anything that we do. In fact, agriculture, I would argue, is the single largest environmental insult we do to the planet today, and yet, ironically, it's perhaps the most necessary. How do we get that one right? We also, of course, are massively affecting our water cycle and the availability of fresh water. This is a picture flying into Phoenix, looking out at the airplane window, seeing iceberg lettuce being grown in the desert using the Colorado River to do it. That's kind of crazy. Now, we're not the only ones who do this in the United States or here in California. There's also examples that are pretty dramatic from here, the former USSR. In 1973, we see a picture of the Aral Sea, one of the great inland seas of Central Asia. But in the 1960s, the rivers that feed that sea, which is surrounded by desert, were dammed, and the water was used instead of feeding the Aral Sea to irrigate the CUGH desert to grow cotton in the middle of Central Asia. Well, you can imagine what happens if you dam up the water supply of the Aral Sea. This is what happens. It's a massive decline in this huge inland sea. If you think about it, that shoreline moved about 200 miles away from one side to the other in just a couple of decades. But this is not just a water impact, it's a human health impact. The dust and contaminants that used to be at the bottom of the Aral Sea. Remember, the USSR never had an EPA or a Sierra Club, okay? So God knows what's at the bottom of the Aral Sea, but we do know, at least anecdotally, and probably a lot more people in this room know more about this than I ever will, is that the cancer rates in this part of the world are among the highest in Asia. There's huge environmental contamination issues, as well as the collapse, obviously, of fisheries and water, and weather patterns are changing. So this isn't just a geophysical tragedy, it's a human tragedy. So water issues are paramount around the world, as well as these land issues, and they're connected, again, through food. Interestingly, about 70% of all the water in the world that we use is used to do one thing: irrigate farmland. 70%. In California, it's 80%, believe it or not. Alfalfa alone consumes more water in California in the last 5 years than all of the human beings in California combined. One crop. And most of that's being sent to the Middle East and Asia for animal feed, mainly for dairies. So that's pretty crazy. Food affects land, and it mostly affects water, more than anything else in the world. So we're changing our planet's land, we're changing our planet's water, again, mostly for agriculture, but a few other things too. And of course, this slide didn't work, but just imagine it did. This slide is supposed to show you a picture of the atmosphere or something. Anyway, PDF. The idea here is that we're changing the atmosphere and oceans themselves too, this issue of climate change. We usually think of climate change as primarily related to energy, which it mostly is. About 2/3 of the emissions of greenhouse gases like CO2 that go into the atmosphere come from our use of energy. But about 1/3 comes from agriculture and a few other smaller industries. So actually, of any economic sector, agriculture contributes more greenhouse gases than any other single part of the economy, because energy is lots of things: electricity, transportation, manufacturing, buildings, and so on. In fact, agriculture releases twice as much greenhouse gas to the atmosphere than all of the world's transportation, which is number 2. So that's a pretty big deal. So we're affecting our planet's land, we're affecting our planet's water, we're affecting our planet's, even our air and our oceans at global scales. And we're pushing this planet really to some of its limits. How long can we keep doing that before we fundamentally undermine the geophysical and biological systems on which upon we all depend? Well, that's going to be the big question. So one of the things that some scientists in our disciplines are thinking about is, how do we put together, a lot of you are doctors and nurses and other things, so in your world, you put together kind of vital signs. How's the patient doing? You might measure height and weight and blood pressure and respiration rates and pulse and all these things. Well, we can do similar things for the planet itself. And this is a notion called planetary boundaries, if you will. This little diagram shows several sectors drawn out there on the circumference of this graph. One labeled at the top climate change, another being the integrity of our biosphere, the land, the fresh water, something called biogeochemistry, kind of the flows of big chemicals around the planet that we need, and so on and so on. You can walk your way around this kind of clock of doom over here, if you will. And if the patient is still in the green areas, down in the core, right there in the middle of that diagram, it's healthy. This is what we've seen for thousands of years. It's normal. What we've seen for all of human existence pretty much would be in the green. But if you start seeing lots of yellows, that's a caution sign oh, we've now pushed maybe beyond anything seen in recent human history. Red, if you will, is going far beyond that into the place of, wow, we've never seen this in even geologic history. This is fundamentally dangerous. You'll see two of them up there already happening. Genetic diversity of plants and animals on this planet is now being lost at a rate that hasn't been seen for 65 million years. The last time that happened was when the dinosaurs went extinct. So we're now in the 6th great extinction event in Earth history. That's one. We see down below the nitrogen cycle, something that Pam's worked on a lot. We're now pushing like 2 to 3 times more nitrogen around the planet than the Earth's crust normally would do, geologically and biologically, almost all of which from fertilizers. That's affecting water quality, like nitrate levels in groundwater, which can lead to blue baby syndrome and all this kind of bad stuff, a health issue. But also nitrogen getting into the oceans, leading to dead zones in the oceans, killing off fisheries and denuding the oceans, coastal oceans especially, of important protein sources for humanity. So nitrogen is a major health problem as well. So we can walk around this, and this is kind of like the vital signs of our planet. And they're not looking too good in a few areas, but a few others, we still have a lot of time to turn it around and make sure we don't have more catastrophic losses. And maybe we could even reverse, especially the nitrogen one, perhaps we could even reverse that and get smarter and better about this. My point, I guess, and I think this is obvious in this room, is when I talk to my colleagues, I want to say, don't talk about this as if this is just an environmental problem. Because it's much bigger than that. It's really about us. We ultimately depend on these critical environmental systems. If they don't work, we don't work. Gaylord Nelson, the person who founded Earth Day, once said, the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. And he was right. He probably should have said health too. So this is really important. If the environment isn't healthy, then we can't be productive. So this isn't an environmental problem. It's a civilization problem. Like, do we get to have one? Okay, I'm a fan of civilization. I, like Gandhi, think they're a good idea. So let's keep that going and see if we can move forward on addressing planetary health, not only of this, but also of future generations, or we don't get to keep one of these. Basically, it's that simple. So we need a different kind of approach in thinking about our civilization, and we've heard a lot about that already today, this word sustainability. Now, I love the word sustainability in a lot of ways, but it's kind of wonky, I'd have to say, and it's not that inspiring, to be honest. If I were to ask you, hey, how's your marriage? And you said, sustainable. Be like, what? That sucks. Nobody wants that. So can we do better than that? So I've always been thinking about, like, when you're talking to, this is a room full of PhDs and stuff. Okay, we can use buzzwords like this, but what does that really mean? Well, it's kind of an awful word for regular folks. So what do we actually want to say? And I like to say, let's have an enduring vitality. We want people to be healthy, happy, prosperous, and having fun, and keep doing it, and let our kids have something even better too. Wouldn't that be great? I don't know if this is perfect, probably not, but anybody who works in marketing or communication tells you we just can't use these science and wonky words all the time. We've got to make them filled with meaning, what they really mean. So it's really about having an enduring civilization and one that's thriving. So let's see if we can do that. So this vision that we have together in this room is really pretty inspiring. Between all of you who work in public health and those who work on the environment, we're doing the same thing. We're trying to figure out how do we have people and nature thrive together today and tomorrow. So that's kind of what this is all about, and I'm really looking forward to some questions about how we link planetary health, your concept of One Health, to this concept of sustainability. And I think they're just the same coin, just looking at it from a different side. So maybe we should work together and try to find how we advance this. Finally, too, I don't know, this is kind of depressing stuff sometimes that we all work on, but I'm an optimist by choice. Probably you are too, because pessimist, why do you even get up in the morning, right? So get up, figure out what you want to do, but also maybe more importantly, figure out what you hope for. This is a beautiful quote from Barbara Kingsolver, a great writer. She once said something that was beautiful, I thought. She said, here's what I've decided. The very least you can do in your life is figure out what you hope for. What I want is so simple, I almost can't say it. Elementary kindness, enough to eat, enough to go around, and the possibility that kids might one day grow up to be neither the destroyers nor the destroyed. And that's about it. So I think we share that vision, and thanks very much. Look forward to having some conversation. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I am not a Mac person, so this is going to be easy. I thought so. I did think so. It's showing here, but not there. Uh-oh.
We're getting help. It's okay.
Okay.
I think I messed it up. It was the two-headed computer.
Oh, I see. Ooh, thank you. It's good. Okay, so good morning, everybody. I think it's still morning, it's before noon. My name is Ndola Prata, and I'm with the UC Berkeley School of Public Health on the faculty in the maternal and child health. And what I would like to discuss with you in the next 10 minutes or so is to call your attention to the role of one important aspect that we've been talking about since this morning. The keynote speaker mentioned planetary health, which is population, and very specific about population growth. John just mentioned something very interesting, that the Earth was infinite and we were small. And that is actually no longer the case. So as you know, the estimates for population growth that we have exceeds 9 billion people by 2050. And nearly all global population, and John had showed that too, but what I wanted to bring you to is where is this growth coming from in the world? And nearly all global population growth is expected to occur in the less developed countries. So this is more or less the map that I wanted to share with you, where so that you can see where rapid population growth is affecting the most. So the population growth rates are measured in terms of percentage increase a year, and anything above 1 becomes to be very fast. As you can see, in a lot of countries, especially in less developed countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, most countries are growing at more than 2% a year. So these large numbers of young people that most of these countries are going to face pose significant challenges for development, whether it's demands for healthcare and education, whether it's to ensure employment. This is just to name a few. So it is really critical that we look at the fertility of these populations and the pace of population growth and link those to see why this matters for development. So some of the threats posed by rapid population growth, and I mentioned as a physician, public health physician and medical demographer, trying to follow what Sam has mentioned this morning, to move from just focusing on health and demography to also think about planetary health. And the way I look at things, just to make a few, is that the rapid population growth that we will see from most less developed countries will affect food security, climate change. The climate change and population growth can affect water supply, demands for healthcare and education, as I mentioned, and opportunities for development would also greatly affect global health. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, so between 1992 and 2010, a 50% increase in child malnutrition. Some of those developing countries, and I talk with some experience of those that in sub-Saharan Africa where I work, they have very weak purchasing power. They tend not to import food from global markets, and that leads to some consumption deficits during times of high prices of food, or sometimes where production declines. So the local people depends a lot on local agriculture. which is critical for food security among especially the rural and the poor, but it's also among the rural and the poor that fertility rates are the highest. So they're the ones that have the largest families. It is also came to my attention that from people working in food security and environmental health, that the declining yields gains are failing to keep up with the rapid population growth. So from the point of view, as you can imagine, as someone that works in population and family planning, and looking at the planetary health, addressing rapid population growth is really an important issue for global health and development. And I wanted to share with you, what many of you already know, but how important it is and the role of family planning to address some of those issues. Family planning is one of the most cost-effective public health interventions, and I'm not going to go into details because this has been shown a lot. They help increase contraceptive use. That leads to significant declines in fertility, and that decline in fertility can address population growth. So in general, provision of voluntary family planning can help slow down population growth. Of course, if you add to the family planning programs goals education and changes in status of women and girls to improve their empowerment, we have even more sort of a significant impact on that. So why is it important? Why is the family planning essential for development? So the Population Reference Bureau published in 2014 that meeting the unmet need for contraception of women in developing countries could each year prevent 54 million unintended pregnancies, 26 million abortions, and 7 million miscarriages, 79,000 maternal deaths, and 1.1 million infant deaths. So this is just one example in terms of the health and well-being of the populations that focusing on family planning to reduce population growth can also bring to the populations. So this alone makes it family planning essential for development. But to go even further, I wanted to show you this graph that was produced by two groups, population family planning and environment. So this is an expert group that was led by the Population Reference Bureau that I was part of on population and climate compatible development. And very quickly you can see that voluntary family planning brings the ability for people to choose how many and how to space their families. That will lead to individual management of time of pregnancy, improving in maternal and child health based on the data that I just showed in the previous slides. That leads to improved resilience and adaptive capacity, and in short term can lead to decreased vulnerability. The lower fertility that we can see as a result of voluntary family planning programs, as I mentioned, also slow population growth, with smaller future populations size can lead to better to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and in the long term mitigate climate change. So just to tying together to what other speakers have mentioned, this is extremely important. The population growth factor is extremely important for planetary health. So, and to bring it all together in terms of development of countries, the reductions in fertility not just allow countries that currently have high fertility to grow economically by taking advantage of a window of opportunity when the fertility comes down and drastic changes in the age structure of the population occur so that they can benefit from the demographic dividend. But family planning programs have, in my view, some direct contributions to some of the key important sustainable development goals. One is poverty, the other one is hunger, that doesn't need explanations, the good health and well-being, especially maternal and child health, as I mentioned before, but also the gender equity. And to me, as a public health professional, but also someone very interested in women and girls empowerment, there is no better empowerment than the power to control your own fertility and to control your own body, decide how many children and when to have them. And at the end, climate action, as a result of a decline in population and the interactions that the population have with the planet, will also become very important. So I'm very optimistic, as John has mentioned, and we do need to be so. And we do not need to be discouraged. There's many opportunities. The glimpse sort of what I showed in terms of where we might be in terms of the number of people in this planet is not set in stone. So those are projections based on what we believe is going to happen given the information that we have today. But this can change with investments in family planning. Even small changes today in fertility, so in family size, can make significant impact in future population size. So we do not need to be disparate, but we do need to accelerate investments in education, meeting the contraceptive needs of women so that we can rapidly decline fertility and maybe not reach those projections that we can see. So a lot of opportunities exist programmatically, but also to fill some gaps in knowledge. Some of our colleagues in this panel already mentioned the multidisciplinary collaborations that is important to address sustainable future in global health. But specifically, I want to focus on two areas that I've been working by bridging the divide of population family planning and health and the environment, and also population family planning and nutrition and food security. So those integrated programs, they'll also need more knowledge in terms of how we expand those programs. For example, the population health and the environment programs, to scale them up, to go beyond sort of the biodiversity small communities in which they have been very successful, but also for the population nutrition and food security, also even identified what really happens at the household level. So theoretically, it makes sense to work together and collaborate. But what really happens at the household level when we improve food security at the community, or the other way around, when the family size is reduced, and how do families allocate sort of the resources in terms of food that they have? So some of us working in these areas can help a lot policymakers and program planners with some of those gaps in knowledge that we can provide. So I want to end in a very positive note that there are many avenues in which we can still mitigate for future generations, specifically related to population growth, some of the targets that we believe we can achieve. Thank you very much.
Great. Is this on? Okay, thank you. I think we've just had a wonderful introduction to our discussions, and to give people a minute or two to think about their questions and come to, this is going to be good, and come to the microphones. Maybe we'll have one question that, to get things going, and then we're going to turn it all over to you guys. Please.
Great. Well, John, I'm still not inviting you to my party. So, so I want to hear a little more from you about, some of the really hopeful stories in, the realms of technology development, or governance, or behavior change, which I know that you track very carefully, that will give us hope that despite the magnitude of the challenges we've all been laying out, that we actually can address those successfully.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the immediate term, there are some incredibly hopeful things going on. For example, the world's CO2 emissions peaked last year. They went down this year. So did my mic. Oh, there it is. Okay. So, like the world's CO2 emissions actually maybe, we'll see if they go back up again, but it's interesting. China's actually peaked a year ago and went down. Will that continue? I don't know. The US, we did what, 10 years ago, Pam? They've been going down every year ever since. In the United States, Brazil has cut its deforestation rate by about 80% over the last 7 years. That's extraordinary. That's like the largest area of deforestation in the world is basically gone. It's absolutely amazing. That alone is the equivalent of taking every car in the United States off the road forever. So that's incredible. Those things have happened without a lot of fanfare, to be honest. I'm really depressed that we don't hear more about those stories in the media, that there are a lot of great things happening. And also look at all the opportunities we have. Think about water. The amount of water, I mentioned water is mainly used to grow food around the world. In Israel, you can use about 1/3 of a liter of water, no, I'm sorry, 3/100ths of a liter of water to grow 1 food calorie. In California, we use 10 times more water to make 1 more food calorie. That's pretty bad. In India, they use 10 times more than California. So there's a 100-fold increase in the amount of efficiency in terms of how much water, how much kind of crop per drop you get from irrigation. What did it take? Some tubes, little tubes, drip irrigation. That's all. It's nothing. It's not rocket science. It's really simple. So we have massive opportunities for efficiency, for improvements and things like this that I see a lot of hopeful signs, but also a lot on the horizon. But lastly, I guess the thing that I think we all need to be reminded of is how incredibly amazing the world is. I like to write my 15-year-old self a letter every so often and tell that person about the world I live in. And I was just thinking about doing that again a couple of weeks ago, saying, hey, guess what, 15-year-old John? Guess what? Hey, the USSR doesn't exist. The Cold War ended without World War III. Apartheid is over. We have an African-American president. Gay marriage is legal. Pot is legal. We're about to have an election in this country where there's going to be, a breakthrough somewhere, no matter which one you vote for. Maybe the first woman, the first socialist, the first Jew, the first Hispanic, and the first clown could be elected. So who knows? Sorry, I should have said that. That is being videoed. Great. But I mean, the world is pretty freaking amazing right now, and there's a lot of cool things.
From here on out, if that president comes in.
I don't think we got very much in the first place, so it's not a problem. But anyway, my point is there are a lot of really great things. All of the existential threats that my generation and a lot of ours in this room grew up with. The Cold War was the single biggest defining issue to global health was, we're all going to die in a nuclear war. That kind of went away, not entirely. But that's not something living over our heads every single day anymore. That's pretty amazing. Or apartheid or other things. So I'm actually pretty hopeful about the world, and I don't see why we shouldn't all be.
Well, with that, as a springboard for discussion, we're going to take 3 questions at a time and then let the panelists respond. So please introduce yourself, and then we'd love to hear your questions, but please keep your questions short, because if you go on and on, I'm going to jump in. Go ahead.
All right. My name is Brian Vaughn. I'm from the Center for Health Ecology Research at Auburn University. Thank you for the opportunity to ask a question. I was really pleased to hear Jonathan Foley's talk. It gave me a lot of insight into why I'm not invited to parties anymore. But one of the things I want to say is Paul Ehrlich in 1971 wrote The Population Bomb. Jared Diamond in 2011 published a wonderful book called Collapse on how societies use the commons to such a great extent that they collapse in conjunction with climate change. Both of those books were bestsellers. Neither of them seem to have changed policy much. Can you tell me, why do you think that you're ringing the same bell now is actually going to cause societies to change the path they've been on for the last 200 years?
Great question. Thank you. Okay, question number 2.
Yeah, hi, Quentin Eichbaum, Vanderbilt University. I'm wondering whether you could comment on the fact that we're bringing together into the same room in Planetary Health people from incredibly diverse backgrounds who don't always necessarily understand each other's language, and we're dealing with enormous complexity. what kind of efforts might be being made? And I think one of the speakers alluded to that, to try and help them understand each other and reduce the complexity of each of those diverse fields.
Great, thank you. And our third question before we go into some answers.
Ann Kemtrip, California Department of Public Health. And to build on that last question and maybe to make it more specific, how do we bring some of the implementers into there? What is being done, say, for example, working with Big Ag or other kind of organizations to embrace these different aspects and make some of those goals a reality?
Great, thank you so much. All right, Pam, please.
I'm going to take the easy ones, 2 and 3, because I think they're very, very, very important and very doable, and we can use the experience of other groups, other communities to see how it's worked. But in the sustainability science realm, where the whole science is about bringing together different disciplines to work on complex problems that are way too complex for one discipline to solve alone. I think we've got a lot of case studies around the country and the world that indicate, first and foremost, it is about language. It is trying to figure out what each other's about, respecting the fact that different disciplines bring different knowledge bases and do it in different ways, and being willing to learn from them. And that takes time, and in many universities we have interdisciplinary institutes set up, increasingly including the health parts of the university, to make that possible, to learn how to work together and understand each other. The other thing I would say on that is, to your point about bringing the decision makers in, one thing that we have learned, I believe, is that if you actually want your information, all this new knowledge that you're creating to be really useful to decision makers, you have to be working with the decision makers from the beginning. Otherwise, you're just waving your arms. You think you know what the problem is, but it's not. And I know medicine has, decades of stories about creating great new things that never get into the hands of decision makers. So do technology areas. Absolutely in this area, same thing. So if we want our ideas, our knowledge that we're creating around these complex issues to be useful, finding the partners is essential. And how to do that from an academic point of view is tough. Again, we've been creating our own boundary organizations, our own linking organizations to help make that possible, or trying to find them wherever they're at. So there's actually a lot of study of this, a lot written on this issue. I'll make one last comment on it. It is what we're doing the worst, I believe. If you look around the world at all the great research that's going on to solve these problems, great research not getting into the hands of decision makers and not being used. So it's where we have to focus our attention.
John, would you like to comment on any of the questions?
Yeah, the first one really intrigued me. It's one that I've heard a few times. I'm sure a lot of us have. This is the question about Paul Ehrlich's prediction about the population bomb and the book Collapse by Jared Diamond and other things. We've seen over the years these kind of fairly dark and depressing books come out as sort of warnings to the future. And then later, decades go by and people react to different ways. One will say, they were wrong, see? Or like, hey, that's so depressing, it's dispowering and it kind of doesn't get people active. The first one is kind of a myth. It's interesting. It's all about what's called the Cassandra paradox. If you make a prediction about the future, you automatically change the future. Paul Ehrlich may have, I'd love to hear our colleague comment on this, maybe not single-handedly, but the discussions in the 1960s about population growth that happened, thanks to him and other people, maybe accelerated the movement into the demographic transition. We saw the biggest decline in fertility in human history happened shortly thereafter. We didn't reach 20 billion people. We're not going to. We didn't have mass starvations the way they're predicted because we got to work. Now, that doesn't happen by accident. The invisible hand doesn't change things. There's no such thing. It's your hands. People getting their hands dirty doing things like improving agriculture and family planning and changing the world. So I don't think those books were wrong. They were thought-provoking. They changed the future. And by definition, of course they were wrong in a way, but they were also bloody right. So I don't know. I think this is an interesting paradox about any call to the future. But I'd rather it's sort of a call to doom, of a call to arms instead. Wouldn't it be nice to read a book that inspired you instead of just scare the hell out of you. Maybe you need a little bit of both, I don't know. But I'd rather inspire people to think about, like, you know, let's get out there and get to work, which is what a lot of people in this room do every single day.
Ndola, please.
Yes, just very quickly, I agree with John, but I'm going to also focus on the number 2 and number 3. To just add a little bit to what was said already, in terms of, I think that one of the areas that we're doing quite poorly is when it comes to the diverse fields, is associated with how the donor funding comes. So, for example, even in my specific experience in trying to integrate population and family planning with nutrition and food security programs, the donor funding comes in sort of a parallel streams. Even when the money comes from the same donor, it comes from 2 different. So it's really hard for even at the implementation level, when policymakers and program partners do understand the benefits and the synergies of working together, it's hard to bring them together. And other things come with very simple issues. How do we measure success that is good for both sides? And issues like that. But in terms of a lot has been done with a lot of organizations and even at the country level to bring together and bridge the divide between the fields. But the reality is that it takes a long time. And I have to be very honest, coming from the population field, that it didn't help that the population control, as it was called before, was tainted to many people in the world. And a lot of our colleagues, both in agriculture, in environmental sciences, and others, didn't want to touch it. And rightly so. So we had to do a lot of changes and a lot of communication strategies. And it's now the burden on us to pull them to work with us on these issues. So for example, it took us, the graph that I showed from this expert group between population and of all around the world between population and environmental health people, when we sat for the first time in the room, we could not believe that we were talking in English but speaking 2 different languages. We couldn't understand each other. So it took many meetings and a lot of work, but it was successful. We came to an understanding that there is no other way. If we want to focus on the health of the planet, we need to work together and find ways to work together. So I'm just going to stop here.
Can I just say one thing with respect to the funding issue that you raised? So we all face all the time. If you want to do new kinds of interdisciplinary work, who's funding it? And eventually the funders come along, but sometimes they decide that they're going to provide glue money. The idea is you all get your own stuff going on, and when you've done all your research, you come together and glue it all together, which is exactly the wrong way to do it. You need the money at the beginning to have that conversation, to define the questions together. So anyway, it is a huge challenge. I just second that.
Actually, I would re-emphasize that when you're trying to develop interdisciplinary programs, you need, one of the best incentives is to have a call for proposals that actually mandates that kind of interdisciplinary collaboration.
I call it matrix money rather than glue money. Right. It's before the fact.
So, okay, our next 3 questions, please. Introduce yourself.
Hi, yes. I'm Kristen Young, PhD student at UC Davis and working at the One Health Institute there. My question actually segues nicely from that. It's about, on the academic side, access to and then sharing of data across disciplines, nations, the world. And then on the public side, how to get the results of that data, all the analyses and the publications to the public in an informative, easy to understand way and not stuck behind paywalls in academic journals. If you could comment on that.
Thank you. Question 2.
Hi, my name is Harry Mando. I'm from the Economist Intelligence Unit in London. My question is about the individuals at a household level. If, for example, over time the economy and commercialization has driven increased need, are you engaging with the private sector to make these changes because they actually have a real impact at the household level? And I'm very interested in the purpose with profit route forward.
Thank you. And our 3rd question.
Hi, I'm Steve Waller. I flew out here from Bethesda, Maryland, and probably share that huge carbon footprint with most of the people in this room. I'm wondering what the panel thinks about holding this meeting virtually next year on Skype or Adobe Connect or some less carbon intense way.
Okay, thank you. So let's take those 3 questions. Who'd like to start? We started this way last time. Ndola, would you like to start? Any of the questions. You don't need to tackle all 3.
Thank you. Well, let me talk a little bit about my personal views on the carbon footprint. It is a real issue. Even this morning, it was alluded. I mean, how much paper we used when it comes to these conferences, and why can we just go? The other thing is that we always trying to create a balance between the importance of the human interaction that sometimes gets lost when we do either webinars or teleconferences or things like that. So maybe there has to be a way that we can have both ways by reducing the carbon footprint. I don't know what that would look like. So I'm just going to raise that as a challenge to all of us to start thinking about it for the future.
Thank you. John, any comments?
Well, I walked here, so no.
You're good. You can come to this party.
So thanks for coming. No, that's a really important point, is the amount of, also just think of the burden on funders and taxpayers and all of your labs of all the travel we do. Do we really, I mean, this conference is great, but how many are sort of unnecessary, really? Maybe we should all cut down a little bit on this as research funding is getting tighter and other things. I think half of it is just the carbon impact, but also the financial and time impact and getting sick on airplanes and all this kind of stuff. I think we could ditch half of it, frankly. But the other question I was really intrigued about was the kind of sharing of science, science to science sharing. Gosh, I hope we can, wouldn't it be great in 5 years to just have no paywalls? I mean, this is so awful. I can't stand that. Maybe NIH and NSF and others should just start demanding that more and more. But also, I know I moved from a university to more of a public science institution at a museum. We're just like a university. We do research and teaching and public engagement. We just do it in the other order than in R1. Public engagement is our #1 job because our financial model depends on it. If we don't do that well, we go under. Just like in R1, research is your main job because that's where the money comes. So we think a lot about science engagement, and I think museums, I'll make a pitch that museums are really great partners for you all, because we see, American museums see 850 million visitors a year, more than all the sports stadiums and theme parks in the country combined. That's one. Second, 70% of what Americans learn about scientific issues is not learned in a classroom. It's not learned in K-12 or universities or medical schools. It's learned in the real world. It can be learned in parks, museums, watching NOVA, reading National Geographic, whatever. So if you really want to engage the world, get out of the ivory tower, because they're not coming to you. You got to go to them. Find a partner. Museums are a good one, but so are parks and aquariums and other places too. Third, museums, I'll just mention, are the most respected institution in the United States. We have a 90% approval rating from Democrats and Republicans. Maybe not anymore after my comment earlier, but universities don't have that anymore. It's very not so bipartisan support of academia, and both are declining. Mostly not because of what you do, but because of things like sports scandals, big administrative bloat, huge tuition increases, student debt, things like that. The brand of universities is declining massively. We got to fix that, because those are some of the great institutions the world has ever seen, is the Research University of the United States. So these are some of the last best institutions. We've got to take better care of them, or they might become irrelevant in the next few decades. So I think we got some work to do, but in the meantime, you've got some partners who can help, and it's a lot of fun.
Thank you.
I think he's said that before.
You think so?
It's a little pitch I get.
I'll just comment really quickly on the carbon footprint, and then I'd love to address the data question. First of all, I do believe in walking the walk, so any organization that says it's concerned about planet and people really ought to embed everything you can do in meetings like this, from the food you serve and the compostability of every item that you serve it in, to travel. And I think it's worthwhile to look at carbon offsets. Meetings, face-to-face meetings do matter. You don't need as many of them as we do, maybe, but carbon offset programs actually can make a difference, not just for the climate system, if it's a good one, but for people. And so I'd love for organizations like this to begin to really push on that. On the data thing, I absolutely think this is one of the longest running, most critical challenges that we've had, but that we're getting close, we're getting to a tipping point right now. For as long as I've been in this business, we've been saying we need integrated databases. We need, the satellite-based and the ground-based and the biophysical ones, and we need the social ones together, and we need the human health things, and we need it all together, and we never have had it, of course. And we still don't have it. But I'm beginning to see organizations like the Moore Foundation funding new approaches to thinking about those kinds of integrated databases. I think we're in a world of transparency in information, so we're going to have more access to lots of different kinds of information. I think we've, on the statistical and mathematical front, data analytics are going to change the way we learn about the world. They are. And I've seen great stuff being done in the human health and vulnerability worlds with data analytics. So I would just say everybody who's coming up right now ought to have one foot in the computational and data sciences world, because things are changing fast, and we really need it.
Great, thank you. So we're going to take our last 3 questions, please. Short and sweet.
Great, thank you very much. My name is Jonathan Nellermo. I'm at the University of Utah at the Center for Global Surgery. And my question to the panel, what is the way forward for young professionals in global health who already recognize the reality of coupled systems and come to this with a systems thinking perspective? What would you suggest we focus on as we build our careers, especially if our ability to influence policy may take another decade before we come into our own?
Thank you. Question number 2, please.
Hi, I'm Ashley Gresh. I'm a community health nurse, and I'm also a midwifery student at Johns Hopkins University School of Nursing. So my question is more focused on putting this theory to practice. So as a frontline clinician, how can we best increase our family planning services and things like that? What are your perspectives?
Great. And I might broaden that out to come back to the question we started with, which is, okay, all this stuff is good and exciting and inspiring, but in the day-to-day lives of the people at this meeting, what do we do differently in global health research, education, and practice?
Hi, I'm Dan Patel. I'm an undergrad at UCLA. So we're learning that what's best for humanity in the long term is also best for the planet. But on a smaller scale for individual and maybe developing nation actions, things that have a lot of economic benefits, which are privatized, have a lot of environmental consequences which are not privatized. So how can we more quickly merge short-term private interests and long-term holistic interests? Thank you.
Thank you. All right. John, we started at either end with the women on this panel before, so you get to start this time.
Oh, okay. Wasn't expecting that. Yeah, I guess the first question, maybe I can respond to a little bit. It's so inspiring to see people breaking down disciplinary boundaries because, the joke, like, universities have departments. The world has problems, and they don't mesh. They're never the same thing. And I used to worry about the kind of virtual university in my head. Like on one floor, people are studying climate change. On the next floor, people are studying demography. And the next floor, people are studying infectious disease and whatever. Well, in the real world, all those problems are thrown in a blender and hit stir, and they're all happening at the same time. So we need to make sure our education, especially at the kind of graduate and professional level, really reflects problem-based learning. Like solving real problems. This Haster's quadrant of use-inspired research, if you will, is so really important. And that's what's so great about people who work in health, because you're there already. I think the rest of us need to learn from you how to do that better, because you're out there in the world like, I got a problem to solve. I don't care what it's called, what discipline it is. We're solving a health problem. So the kind of practice, research, blend of public health is so fantastic. And I think you're more advanced in this than perhaps any academic discipline. In a lot of the academic disciplines, we still pretend that if we just throw our research over the wall, there's somebody on the other side who's going to pick it up and use it. And sadly, what we find is there's a giant pile of papers on the other side of a wall that nobody's reading. Give me a break. When each index is, or impact factor of 5 is great, it means 5 people read it. That's it. Kim Kardashian can do that a second. Come on, this is a joke. So we got to do a better job of integrating research with practice and ultimately with policy too, at all levels. And I don't know. I mean, this is a group I would ask that question of, not myself or others. But that's really important. But the other thing is about systems thinking. That is one of the great levelers across disciplines. That's one of the things, I suspect Pam has a lot of thoughts about this too. But when you learn, a basic discipline as an undergrad, or maybe two, that's great, but what are the things that help you translate disciplines, this idea of transdisciplinary learning? And that's where systems thinking, learning about other, the way you think itself and how you look at large, complex systems has been incredibly powerful. I started off my undergrad, I'm an astrophysicist by an undergrad, for crying out loud. I mean, and it doesn't matter what you studied after a while. It's just really, how do you think, how do you communicate to other disciplines, and can you solve a problem? That's what we need to be teaching students, not just the factoids of the day of a particular discipline, because those get irrelevant very, very fast.
Thank you. Pam, would you like to follow up on that?
Well, and it takes it to your question and the second question. I think that knowledge to action continuum is the key spot. I mean, it's totally fun to do the interdisciplinary research and to feel, like you're learning from each other, and maybe you're going to make a difference in the world, and that's great. But you really want to be positioning your research so that it can make a difference in the world and is likely to. And I think about that as, in a sense, a supply chain. There are a lot of pieces of knowledge that are needed in order to solve some of these really complex problems, and the different disciplines and different perspectives are weaving into that. But if nobody is watching that supply chain, very often you've got big missing chain links. And so the community that's on the decision-making side, the action side, ends up there with 2/3 of what they really need, but they can't do anything. And so I think finding collaborations and partnerships where somebody's actually paying attention to that outcome and actually has some influence in filling in the missing links of the chain or the network leads to some better solutions and some better outcomes. And of course, companies have that, but public challenges often don't. So I would say in the global health community, really asking communities of people, partnerships of people to think carefully about the full supply chain of knowledge so that all these great things can actually be used in the end. And that requires often a public-private partnership.
So I just can't resist saying one thing in relation to that, and that is that I think a very important emerging paradigm for all of us in global health research is implementation science in relation to this, and really thinking about the application of a framework of systematic methods that allows us to increase the speed, fidelity, efficiency, and coverage with which we move from the more basic research to large-scale national or transnational programs. And at the University of Washington, this is an area that we are very, very invested in, both in terms of our PhD training program and in terms of our research. But I think it's very relevant here. So, Ndola, please.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to focus on the last two questions, but a little bit on the young professionals too, but with a focus specifically on family planning, how to move research for action. Let me just start by saying, family planning programs work. I know you don't know me. Please trust me. They do work. What makes a difference in implementation is how the difference in terms of how some are more successful than others is two things: implementation and resource allocation. So at the implementation level, it's not one size fits all. So we have to adjust and adapt to the populations, to the social cultural environment, to the human capacity, who can provide which methods in which country. So, and the strategies that are developed, the political support behind it, and then the resources for it. Right now, we do not have, for the least developed countries that I mentioned, that need the family planning services for the reasons of population growth, economic development, and health, specifically maternal and child health, there are not enough financial commitments to those countries. And I have to tell you that my grandmother, when I was very young, used to tell me, money doesn't make you happy, but it helps. And how did I learn that in family planning? And it comes again and again and again. Let me give you just 1 second. In February, I visited Togo and Burkina Faso as part of a large program to evaluate supply-side strategies for family planning. It is not really rocket science when you look at those data, what the issues are with implementation in the programs. So you see the free family planning days, a lot of long-acting methods go up. In the clinic days, normal clinic days, they continue the base. So I asked the question, how much do you charge for an implant? $2. So it is very expensive for a poor woman in rural Togo to pay $2 upfront to get an implant. So it means that she has to wait for the free family planning day. So it's not really difficult when you look at this data to realize where the problems are with the family planning programs. We know their work. It's how we implement them and how much energy and financial resources and human capacity that we put into those programs is what makes the difference. So I think that for the next generation of where to focus, wherever areas in global health, wherever areas you are working, please remember population growth and family planning. Whether you are infectious diseases, whether you are, so one of my students the other day sent me an email from Russia, where is working on control of TB, that he actually brought up in the conversation that it is important to do, to look at population issues and provide options for men and women. So it is extremely important because it's part of our day. So don't make that a population family planning expert issue. It's everybody's issue because it affects populations that, as we try to explain here, affects planetary sustainability. So if more specifically you want to focus on areas of population and family planning, implementation, innovation in implementation, distribution channels, how best to reach to hard to reach populations at the lowest cost possible, is probably the area that we need to make significant progress moving from research to practice.
Great, thank you. Sam, the last word is yours, and then it's lunchtime, right?
All right, well, thanks. I'll keep it brief. That's a scary place to be between you and your lunch. This has been fabulous. Thank you so much to all the panelists. One of the richest conversations I've heard in a long time. So really thank you so much. And outstanding questions. I think what I've heard is that these are very complex, very challenging problems, and they're not optional. They're problems that we have to address. I've heard the word partnership over and over in different contexts, and questions about sharing and coming together and breaking down silos, and the challenges of interdisciplinary work, interdisciplinary data sharing, interdisciplinary communication, interdisciplinary funding. These are the challenges of this space, and I think they are surmountable. So, to me, it's very exciting. A quick plug that this is exactly what we're trying to do with the Planetary Health Alliance, is to forge that kind of community and to hear from all of you about how to make that meet your needs. So please join us, look at the app, and come to the lunch if you can. But what a rich conversation. Thank you all so much.